So in terms of your browser being the application, we know that the server is really just sending HTML to the client, right? HTML and some script files, right? The client is basically getting this page. They're interacting with the page through a DOM, right? So you could have, links that are embedded. And so the interaction is happening with the DOM. What ends up happening after that is that with an Angular application, as the client is interacting with your application, they are going to be they're going to be hitting the server, right? But it's going to be an AJAX request. Most of the work is going to end up being on the client. So, little by little, you'll end up interacting with the server. We could, again, think about it in terms of our trip planner application, where we were sort of going back and forth to add attractions or items to our trip, or adding days, or that sort of thing. So what Angular becomes really helpful with is the idea that you could set up components in your application. So you have the ability to, and this is done a couple of different ways, but really you have the ability of separating out UI components. You could set up, what we're going to look at are going to be controllers that'll handle different pieces of your application. So you're able to separate out the functionality, get things working so you no longer have that spaghetti code, and you're able to build these blocks with your application. And for starters, we're going to do this in the form of controllers. That's what we're going to end up taking a look at. So let's just go back a little bit and think about where you end up. So obviously the thing is here is that we're not going to be working with static data. Our data is going to end up changing, meaning that when we end up clicking on a trip or something, or we end up adding something to the trip, the trip is going to end up changing. If we ended up editing something, or we're looking at let's say we were looking at a list and we click on a link and we want to see the detail, it's going to be the detail that's going to be changing. So if we thought about templating, we have this whole idea in templating where you end up having a template and you have what we call the locals object. And if you say to Swig, hey, look, Swig, here's my HTML and here's my locals, you end up getting back this HTML. But what ends up happening with Swig is that at the point that our template is served, Swig is gone. Sometimes that's confusion. People ask about Swig on the client side. And again, in terms of the client is just getting HTML. So whatever parameters were put in the template, it doesn't really matter. What the client gets is this HTML, and there really is no way of going back. It's not like we could go up and say, hey, look, Swig, do me a favor. You rendered this template on the server. Could you change it for me? We can't do that on the client. We could go back to the server and ask that to be done. But when it gets to the client, you can think of that template as just being this static string. Nothing is changing. And change is good, right? We like change. We could see change in technology, how things progress. And in our application, we want things to change as well. So, for instance, if in fact we have this object and the user ends up clicking on a new book to a new title, right, we want that to be shown. Or if the user clicks on another one, we want that to be shown as well. And the thing that's going to allow us to do this in Angular is something called the scope. And let's take a look and see how that ends up getting used. So let's switch back to our web page over here. And Angular gives us the ability to generate a controller. So the way to do this is to say, Angular, I want to create a controller, and I'm going to create a controller called myControl. And so the way that this works, let's take this out. And in fact, I did this incorrectly. It's not Angular that creates the controller. It's my application that'll end up creating the controller. So there's, again, two different ways that I can do this, because that controller is going to be associated really with my application or my module. And just so you could see this, let's take out this over here. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to put a div here. and I'm going to use another directive. So there's another directive called ng-controller. And again, when the DOM is loaded, this will end up getting parsed, and Angular is going to see, is there a controller called myControl, the same thing that it ended up doing with the ng-app directive. And without even putting anything in here, if I was to go back and reload this, nothing's there, but there's also no errors, okay? But again, like I showed you with the application, if I was to put a lower m there, Angular is not going to like that. It's going to say, you know, I'm trying to, what it's trying to do is it wants to call this function. That's what happens when it sees this controller. Now, I want to show you one other thing that's kind of important here. What will happen is that every time you use this controller on your page, this function will end up getting instantiated. So I'm actually going to go in here, and I'll put another div here. And I'm going to say, yeah, this is also my control. So the controller is basically going to be the template for this part of the DOM. And again, no error here. This will be totally fine. Not necessarily, because I changed this to before. This needs to be a capital M, right? It's case sensitive. And I want to point out something that's really important that people sometimes trip up on a little bit. Because there's going to be different behaviors when we end up looking at services. But for controllers, we're going to see that this console log is going to get executed twice. So this function, you can see it ends up getting called twice. There's two different controllers. And just to sort of prove a point here, what I want to do, the way that data ends up getting passed, if I want to pass data from my controller to what would be considered here my HTML, which is using this controller, I can end up doing that through something called the scope. So the scope, how do you get the scope of a controller? Well, when your controller ends up getting called, okay, Angular does something kind of interesting. It does dependency injection. And if you end up putting, Angular is aware of an object called the scope. And what it will do is it'll end up creating a scope for you when your controller ends up getting created. So Angular does something which is called dependency injection. It actually sort of sniffs out as a string, and it knows, it's aware of what a scope is, and it ends up creating a scope. What this allows me to do is to go in here and to say scope foo equals bar. Now that doesn't mean all that much. There's no error that's going to end up getting created here. But if I was to go and go over here and use my template and put an expression in here for foo, so the only things that are available in here are either going to be just static strings and numbers like we did before, or anything we put on the scope. So now you can see that we have bar, not terribly exciting. Let's also do something else. Remember how before I was trying to do math.random here? And nothing was happening? The reason why nothing was happening is that Angular, in its template, is not aware of the math object. Just how it is. You don't have access to everything here. And again, Angular is the one that's doing the work, and Angular, in its expression, doesn't recognize the math object. It's sort of a limited subset of JavaScript that you could use there for those expressions. But if I was to go over here and say scope.math equals the Windows object math class, then in fact, I would end up getting a random number. And there's something else about here that it doesn't like. If we wanted to generate a random number, an easier way to do it might be to say scope.random equals math.random. And now I could just put in my random number. And this is not a method. This is just part of the scope. I'll show you how you can actually put methods on your scope as well. So here's a random number on this one, and I could get a brand new random number on here. Again, these are going to be totally independent of each other, right? Every time I click on this, you're going to get two new random numbers. So that's the whole idea, that you could end up passing something to the scope. And you could also end up putting a method on the scope. So if I was to say something like scope get random is a function. Again, these are just, the way to think about this is that don't think about your scope as being anything magical. Think about it as just being an object, just being a vessel that you could end up adding things to. So if I end up doing scope get random, I can return a math.random, in which case I could go over here and say get random. Again, there's a little bit of an inclination, I think, when you're first learning this to start using the word scope here, but it really is anything that's on your scope is going to be accessible from within your controller. So if I went out over here, yeah, there's definitely something that it doesn't like about calling this math.random here. That I'm going to have to investigate a little bit. But this could be an interesting thing to find out. So let me take this off. And I just want to point out one other thing here. If I'm outside of my controller, and I say foo, first of all, the question is which foo would it point to? Okay? And so what it does here is it doesn't error out at all. What happens is, Angular says, hey, look, I don't know what this is. This is not on any scope that I'm aware of. It'll end up working inside of the controller, but it won't work when it's outside of the controller. So your scope allows you to pass data that can end up getting used in your controller. Let's just point out one other thing here. You also have the ability to actually set up some events. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say scope say hi. And when I tell my scope to say hi, I'm going to tell it, hey, look, when you say hi, I'm going to say console.log, show me your random value. Log it out. Now, right now, I don't have any way to hit this. I mean, I could put this method here, but usually you're going to end up calling a method based on some interaction. So what I could do here is I could put in a button. And so there's another directive called ngClick. And so what ngClick does is ngClick is going to call some function. And so I'm going to say, hey, look, when you click on this button, and again, underlying all this, Angular is basically wiring up to the underlying DOM elements. It's putting an on-click on that, but it's keeping track of all this stuff. But again, this is aware of your scope. So here I could end up saying, I want you to say hi when this ends up getting clicked on. Again, I'm just putting this on my top controller. But if I do this, it'll end up showing my random number. If I was to go and copy this down here, it's going to show the other random number. So this is going to show the 0.98, and this is going to show the 0.61. So that's kind of an interesting thing to see. We could also make this a little bit more interesting in the sense that, what if when we call say hi, what if we went in here and we said, when you go to say hi, let me say scope.random equals a new random number. So what should happen is that every time I click on that button, I should end up getting a new random number. And the sort of takeaway here that's interesting is that what I'm able to do here is I'm able to change my scope. And you could think about this scope as different from when you're dealing with a template in Swig, when you're dealing with Angular controller and scope, you can think of that scope as a living object, and if that object ends up changing, it's going to end up changing on our view here. Now, let's just bring up one other thing that's kind of cool. So I said, hey, look, if we change random, this will end up changing. Let's do something else here. I'm going to say window set timeout, and I'm going to put a function in here. And I'll say, look, after 1 second. And the function that I'm going to end up putting in here is going to be, hey, look, take my random and let's change it to hello, just for the kick, just for kicks. So we should end up seeing a random number, and then we're just changing this, and I'm doing it after 1 second. Now, what I told you before is that when the scope changes, right, this DOM there's an interaction. There's a two-way model binding between my scope and what I have within my controller. And so if I do this and I wait a second, nothing is going to happen. We could actually even go in here and we could actually inspect this element. This is kind of an interesting thing to do by looking at the scope. So if I was to go over here, one of the things you could do is if you do $0, this is a Chrome thing, you'll end up getting a DOM element. And if I say angular.element $0, now I've got this Angular element, and I could ask for its scope. And I think, so here's my scope. I could actually take a look at my scope. And if I actually look at my scope, I'll see, in fact, that on my scope, there's a bunch of other things on here. But I could actually see random is set to hello. But notice that it didn't end up changing it up here. So if I want to change it, what I could do is that what happens is that Angular ends up basically running through these what are called digest cycles. So when there's some interaction with the DOM that Angular is aware of that interaction, what it'll end up doing is it'll end up updating the scope. But Angular is not aware of this change in the set timeout. So what you have to do in order to get this to work, this is something that you really don't have to do on a regular basis, and there's a way around it. But if you actually say, hey, look, Angular, even though you weren't aware of this, right, we did it within a set timeout, we want to make you aware of it. We want you to update the DOM. We want you to what's considered going through a digest cycle. And we should see that this changes after 1 second. So this is not something you normally have to do. In fact, there's a way to get around that, which is that another thing that you can inject here is you could actually inject a timeout. And so instead of using set timeout, you could use timeout. And if you use timeout, Angular will basically wrap your code and call the digest cycle. So that's something that you should be aware of. You should know that there's this thing which is the digest cycle, which again, you don't have to worry about it here. This will work, and this will work. And the reason why it'll work is that we've ended up putting this on the scope. And really what it is that when there's a DOM interaction here, what ends up happening is says, all right, I know that there's a DOM interaction. You just ended up changing something on the scope. And it ends up going in and ends up running the digest cycle. So you don't have to do it here because this method is on the scope, but when we're inside a window timeout, even though the scope had changed, there's nothing that is going in and running the digest cycle. You don't want to constantly run the digest cycle. You want to run it at the appropriate times, and usually the appropriate times is when the user has some interaction with the DOM. So this is one other thing to just point out here is that there's nothing that prevents you from passing, more complex, objects here. For instance, if I was to go here and say foo and go here and say bar is equal to baz. So now foo is an object. If I was to go here and reload this, I would see that bar was equal to baz, but I could even go down here and access the bar property over here and access it over here. In which case, you could see, again, it's a little sort of strange behavior, but the bottom line is that your data is available from the scope to be used inside of the controller, and when the values on that scope value change, there's two-way data binding, and it will also end up changing in the view. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at sort of going in the other direction, and we're going to talk about using something called ng model, which will allow us to really pass data back and forth. So let's actually take a look at that. That'll be in our next presentation here. So just to summarize this a little bit, we've got this whole idea that within our controller, we really have the ability to template things, and the templating is being done by using these template expressions, and they're interacting with our scope. So again, if we had this scope set up, we could use these values on our view, and really it gives us the ability to have this, to interact with our DOM, right? So we looked at this whole concept of controllers where we have a template and we have a scope, and it's the controller that has the ability to pass this data back and forth. So our user interface really is a combination of our templates and our scope, but it's being done within the context of a controller. And again, a key thing here is that this scope is just a regular object. So you saw how we could end up setting values on our scope and how our views would end up changing. We also saw that if we ended up doing a timeout, things wouldn't quite work. We actually had to tell Angular to end up recalculating the template, but we could actually do that within the context of a $sign timeout. So we saw the idea of using the digest. So what this is going to give us the ability to do is to build up these blocks by using these controllers. And again, the other thing that's really important is that every time you use a controller, it really becomes a separate instance with its own scope. So let's actually now take a look at how we might be able to deal with here. We're just looking at items. Let's look at some utilities that will give us the ability to do some interesting things. For instance, we can end up, if we have something on the scope that's a collection, we could end up iterating over it. So let's do kind of a simple example of that as well.